having been chosen to take on and share leadership in this our land. We pray as they deliberate today, they will continue to appreciate the magnitude of the responsibility that has been entrusted to them. May they exercise this power of leadership with humility and compassion, recognizing that to whom much is given, much is required. Help them to continue to acknowledge the implications of their decisions and enable them to open their hearts and minds to be constantly influenced by the power of your Holy Spirit. That Spirit that promises to lead us as your people into all truth, a truth that will set us free. May they all seek to follow the promptings of that Spirit, so that in all that they say and all that they do may be in accordance with your will. And we ask these things in the name of him who came and died, that us people may have lives lived in all abundance, even Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Now we pray as our Savior Christ has commanded unto us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
This House is in session. Minutes of the meeting held on Friday, August 5th, 2022 to be deferred. All members in
Speaker begs to move that minutes as referred to be deferred.
The question is that the aforementioned minutes be deferred. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are hereby deferred.
By Your Honor the Speaker. Messages from Her Excellency the President, petitions, papers, government notices, private members' notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees, first readings of bills, statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, 5, 43, and 44 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
The question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business, sir.
Government business is the order of the day.
Order number 5, in the name of the Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Food and Nutritional Security, to move the second reading of the Protection of Agricultural Products Bill 2022.
Honourable member for St. Philip South.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to move the second reading of this bill, the Protection of Agricultural Products Act 2022. I give thanks to the good people of St. Philip South who have again reposed their trust and confidence in me to be able to deliver what I deem to be a very important piece of legislation in the armory of agriculture, and therefore I owe them a debt of gratitude. Mr. Speaker, the times we're living in are such that you may find conversations that would want to make Barbadians believe that such times are so lugubrious that we ought not even try. And therefore, it is against that backdrop, sir, that I feel that we need to clarify a number of things in order for us to be able to anchor this legislation and provide the protection to the farmers in Barbados and not treat to it the other way around, where when this bill was presented in 2017, it was presented in such a way that you would feel that the farmers were the culprits, and therefore they were the ones being penalized under the Act. I say so, Mr. Speaker, sir, because of the multiplicity of procedures and applications that farmers had to go through in order to prove ownership of produce. And Mr. Speaker, to my mind, having gone through this legislation, having gone through the previous legislation, and having actually gone through the debate of November 2017, I am convinced that there was utter confusion in the presentation of what was intended to be a bill to protect farmers and mitigate predial larceny. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have had the privilege, first of all, to consult widely before even attempting to make changes to this legislation. And it is important for us to note that in the debate that took place in this honorable chamber when the previous Minister of Agriculture, the then honorable member for St. Philip West, attempted to present this legislation, he indeed made several missteps in seeking to mitigate against predial larceny. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, the then leader of opposition, the honorable member for St. Michael Northeast, who is now the Prime Minister of Barbados, in speaking to the presentation in response to what was presented, she made it clear that this legislation, or the legislation at the time, did not stand the test of time simply because there was no stakeholder consultation. And therefore, the minister was about to foist upon the farmers of Barbados legislation that was not designed, first of all, to protect them, but more than anything else, humbug them. And at the same time, without that consultation, then obviously the legislation would be void of the things that the farmers would like to see introduced that would help them to be able to manage their farms and mitigate predial larceny. And Mr. Speaker, I think it is very important for us to note that consultation when bringing legislation to this honorable chamber, especially legislation that will impact the lives not just of the stakeholders involved, but all people in this country, then we start to understand that without that consultation, innocent people can get hurt. And equally, the good that we are seeking to do may very well turn out to be that which turn innocent people into criminals. Now, I am completely appalled at the fact that legislation was laid in this honorable chamber where it purported to suggest that because a person is a vendor, that the produce that that person is selling may very well be the subject of predial larceny. That was the first thing that I found extremely unfortunate. The other thing that really took the mickey out of me was when they wanted to foist upon the people of Barbados and the farming community and the vendors of this country wardens who would have the power of arrest without any formal training like a police officer. And therefore, a warden under suspicion can stop you, confiscate your goods, and arrest you. These wardens, sir, were to be appointed by instrument by the minister. Imagine that. So a minister of agriculture took it upon himself through a cabinet decision with an attorney general who should have known better, but clearly he did not, and sought to foist upon Barbadians and the stakeholders in the farming community a set of wardens who can just arrest people under suspicion, confiscate their goods because they didn't have a certificate to prove that the goods were either legitimately obtained or were in fact theirs and that they were not being legitimately conveyed. Now, against the same policy, sir, the certificates that were supposed to be produced for the minister to sign off to people to show as proof were sometimes not printed by the government printery. And so therefore, you would go just like is the current case with tourism, where people who want a temporary license, when those books are not available, the rental companies cannot issue a temporary license. And you know that if such matters have been a problem in the past, why do you take a 21st century construct and requirement to root it in to a 20th century or even a 19th century policy where you have to wait on certificates to be printed and sent to a ministry in order for farmers to be able to get certificates to prove ownership? And then equally, you then turn around and you say, those people who are transporting as well, they must be subjected to the same rigors. And then, if that wasn't enough, Mr. Speaker, sir, you then introduce penalties to put people in prison and charge them fines without giving them time to prove ownership. And so I think at the core of that discussion which took place in this honorable chamber, the debate that took place at the time, sought to correct these wrongs and to help the minister then to understand that progressive legislation must be centered around how people can be able to improve themselves whilst enjoy protection from the law. And that, to my mind, was a tremendous failing at the time under the previous minister. But I am not surprised either, and I want to make it abundantly clear, I wish to place on record, that this presentation this morning is really not centered around the previous administration. But it would be remiss of me if I didn't draw to your attention and to the public's attention what had actually taken place in Barbados in a rush effort in 2017 to get this legislation passed prior to an election that was pending. And so, Mr. Speaker, when the minister spoke, he literally confused a number of issues as they relate to food safety and food security. And the notion that we would want to have food sovereignty and food security is actually a noble one. But the fact that you would confuse the legislation that speaks to food safety and spend most of your presentation on food safety without demonstrating where the legislation is going to come from and how it's going to be anchored was in fact a travesty. Because the predial larceny legislation should have been the core subject of the presentation. And in truth and in fact, food safety formed the core part of the legislation. Now, I support food safety, but I agree completely with the leader of the opposition at the time, who then said and cautioned the minister and said to the minister, if indeed you want to speak to food safety, and if indeed you want to speak to food security and food sovereignty, go for phytosanitary legislation. And that is absolutely correct. And if a Minister of Agriculture could confuse the two in a manner in which, to my interpretation, this has been confused, then it does not surprise me either that the punitive measures that were introduced were also confusing. Because I think the administrative approach is the correct approach, but the measures that were used to achieve the objective were, to my mind, a disincentive for the farmers and indeed a humbug. And when we consulted with them, first of all, we did several consultations. And Mr. Speaker, if you would bear with me so that I can highlight them. And I want to highlight them simply because it is important for the country to know what actually took place before this legislation came back here. First of all, predial larceny has now become very organized business. It is not simply a case of someone stealing a crop. And many times people are mistaken, and one may get the impression that this is all about a fellow going and stealing some sugar cane or some sweet potatoes, etc. That is part of the problem. But the real problem, sir, is when those people are confronted by the owners. They have weapons that they are prepared to use in their own defense on the farms on which they are carrying out theft. And, Mr. Speaker, sir, they also have proper storage facilities in which they can store goods. And they have as well very modern, very contemporary vehicles as well. So what this is telling us, it is telling us, one, that they have organized themselves in such a way that they are prepared to carry out this offense, carry out this criminal act, but at the same time, they have invested in what is required in order that they may confront in what they may deem to be their self-defense, the owners of the crops. And then, Mr. Speaker, the fact that they can have storage capacity and contemporary vehicles will tell you that there's huge profit to be made in this activity. So this is not simple, straightforward business we're talking about. You're talking about organized crime, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, we have more than enough cases which we can cite by many farmers who have drawn to our attention crops that they lost, be it bananas, at Edgecombe, be it sweet potatoes at BAMC, be it yam. We can go on and on and on. And truth be told, Mr. Speaker, innocent people at times find themselves with these stolen crops, but equally, there are those people who are part of the criminal chain, that's what I would like to refer to it as, who are prepared to take stolen produce to retail to the public of Barbados. In seeking to address this problem, Mr. Speaker, we have looked at the legislation and we've sought to address how we can introduce a better way of protecting the farmers. And therefore, it meant that we had to look at repealing the Prairie Larceny Act, Prairie Larceny Prevention Act, Cap 142A, which was part of the 2017 legislation. And we then had to also repeal the Protection of Agricultural Products and Livestock Bill 2017 to come up with legislation that will be more suitable based on our consultation with the farmers, based on our consultation with the Barbados Police Service at the time, the Royal Barbados Police Force, and based as well on our consultation with the vendors. And we saw it necessary to consult with everybody because, first of all, the implications for their existence, but equally the way they were being targeted in the 2017 bill. We also had lengthy consultation with the Chief Parliamentary Council, and the ministry also held a national consultation on prairie larceny on June the 14th, 2019, which attracted a wide cross-section of the local farming community, as well as representation from the Barbados Police Service. We took feedback, and I would like to share some of the feedback we got. The multiple certificate regime was cumbersome and would discourage farming. The Act made no distinction between persons engaging in farming simply for their own benefit, such as those with kitchen gardens, and those who engage in activity on a commercial basis. The prevalence of prairie larceny implied that there is a ready market for the receipt of stolen produce by vendors and business people, including restaurants and supermarkets. Greater enforcement of the legislation was required, and they also recommended that we have a rapid response unit that is to be established not in the Ministry of Agriculture, but within the Barbados Police Force. And then, of course, the installation of technology and security systems as well to be used, and drones were a very, very, very popular part of all the recommendations when it came to technology. So that, Mr. Speaker, when we went to Cabinet on the 2nd of July, 2020, the Cabinet took note of the recommendations that were made. The Cabinet noted that the Ministry has engaged in stakeholder consultations to solicit feedback for proposed amendments to the Protection of Agricultural Products and Livestock Act 2017 and proposed Protection of Agricultural Products and Livestock regulations. And amongst all the other recommendations as well, the Cabinet also noted that the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security is seeking to have the use of drones by the agricultural sector included in the proposed civil aviation unmanned aircraft systems regulations 2020, which will be administered by the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport to govern, inter alia, the use of drones within the sector. And so, Mr. Speaker, we then proceeded with the CPC to be able to come up with legislation that will be more suitable, or what I refer to as a suitable fit for what is required to address or mitigate prairie larceny. And I want to say that we need a number of things as well in order for us to address prairie larceny. You can have good legislation that is prepared better than the badly drafted legislation that was brought to this honorable chamber in November of 2017. But equally, you need a mix of intelligence in order for us to be able to deal with this problem. Now, Mr. Speaker, when looking at facilitating things to prevent prairie larceny, we have agreed that you must have on-farm surveillance training and empowerment, and you have to put systems in place similar to how we have the neighborhood watch communities. You have to have farmers looking out for each other and reporting unusual activity within farming districts. We need a serious public education regime in order for us to create a consciousness among people who will be purchasing from here on, and helping them to be able to understand the reason why there is a system in place. And of course, we need now to do a very heavy set of PSAs addressing all aspects of prairie larceny and helping to educate the public as to why we need to deal with this problem. For detection, Mr. Speaker, we have agreed that we need to use drones and use them effectively. We know that there are various types of drones. There are what you call the very high-tech drones that can fly for over 60 minutes. And then there are drones, basic drones, that will probably give you half-hour flying time. And the drones that are going to fly for 60 minutes, Mr. Speaker, must then be able to cover a larger geographic space than those that will be flying for approximately 30 minutes. But this comes down really and truly to the sector determining now how we're going to approach the use of drones, and indeed working with the Barbados Police Service. And then we have to look at how we're going to track primary agriculture produce and livestock by way of using tags, and I do believe that this is one of the things that was recommended to the previous minister when this matter went to the upper chamber. And the use of ultraviolet or nanoparticles on plants as well. And then, of course, we need then to be able to manage and enforce the legislation. But legislation on its own will not get us to where we want to. We have to have a mix of approaches in order for us to come up with the right metric to be able to tackle this problem. Mr. Speaker, I am confident that we have taken the right decisions as far as moving to such systems where we can then address this matter of prairie larceny. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that in addition to putting those systems in place, we need also to be able to produce. And we can have also the best systems to deal with prairie larceny, but we also need to be able to produce. And Mr. Speaker, I must say to you that there's a tremendous amount of work going on right across Barbados right now under the BAMC and the BADMC in order for us to be able to get production up. And when I speak of the work that is taking place, I am doing so ever conscious of the fact, Mr. Speaker, that what we are doing today is designed specifically to make sure the farmers involved can reap their crops and that they don't come to a place where they find the fields are empty, the crops are taken, and then there's a place for people to sell them. I am convinced, Mr. Speaker, that the work we are doing at Mount Poyer, where we've now got 92.5 acres of land into production, Ferry Valley and Christchurch, 27, Graham Hall, 18, Spencer's, etc., a total of 342 additional acres of land in production, providing crops and allowing for 250 additional farmers to come on and make a living. And that, Mr. Speaker, we also have 3 different Rastafarian tribes now at Bath, also planting sweet potatoes and yams, and also what we call cash crops, things like lettuce and tomatoes, etc. And the expansion of the feed program, Mr. Speaker, has led us now to be able to incorporate into the program lands that were under the BAMC. So we will now be moving to vineyard, and we also will be moving to the north of the island to take up lands that were under the BAMC in order for us to be able to further advance the feed program. Now, the major problem that we had in Barbados when it came to providing land and opportunity for people under the feed program was water. And the government has now invested in water at River, and we have also invested in water at Lears. But over and above that, Mr. Speaker, the government has purchased a number of 1,200-gallon water tanks in order for us to provide water for farmers at the same locations that I mentioned, totaling 105 1,200-gallon water tanks for farmers to be able to get water. And then in order for the tanks to be properly fixed to the ground, we had to put in concrete bases that allow for us to put in those tanks, and there were a total of 142. Now, this, in addition to the irrigation water that the farmers are getting, in addition to the agricultural rate, which is now $1.80 rather than the $4.66, up to as high as 7-something per cubic meter, is allowing for farmers to be able to access water and to increase production. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm amazed sometimes when people speak about agriculture in the way they speak about agriculture. And it is almost as if they are suggesting to the people of Barbados, and that's why I always say, when somebody says something, it's always best to go and check, you know. I read an article, Mr. Speaker. I must tell you, I must admit that the article is well written. So well written that I kept a copy of it because I thought it was useful. The author started by saying, first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then he went on to speak about agriculture and what is, everybody can tell you how much the government is supposed to invest and how much the government is supposed to put in. And that the farmers must get every single thing from the government, but they don't recognize how much the government is doing. And the fact that we spent over $20 million in providing water, first of all, for farmers who for many decades couldn't get water. And the fact that we created the feed program, which was spending $2 million a year. And the fact that the BADMC has this year spent $1.1 million in providing water systems and providing planting material and cultivation services for farmers, Mr. Speaker, sir. The fact that the government continues to put billions of dollars in the sugar industry. The fact that the government is even now working on transitioning the sugar industry into a PPP so that private farmers can take ownership, and that we have gone the full 9 yards in making sure that under that arrangement, laborers who work on farms can now become owners through the purchase of shares. And that in that arrangement as well, we have also looked at making sure a sugar factory is to be given to its rightful owners, and that is the private sector. And that the government must come out of that commercial space so that it can become more efficient and profitable. And to make sure that all of this is taking place where the risk is reduced, the government has a carve out space for renewable energy in agriculture as well. And so when I read this article, and I ain't done with this article yet, because the sweetest part will come. When I read this article, I asked myself, where is this man living? Now, I understand people's passion to write, and I enjoy reading. So when I read this, I enjoyed the reading. But the facts of it were mind-boggling. That you can write so well, but you don't research. So anything that comes to your mind based on your experience in the past, because you would have had a career that dealt with such matters, that you think we are still in the 19th or 20th century. And the fact that living right here in Barbados, you don't recognize the fact that all of what you're saying, the government is already doing. Barbados cannot feed itself, so we have to import a substantial portion of our food. But we should not be importing what our farmers can produce simply because it is cheaper. Well, the feed program was introduced for us to be able to produce all of those things and go further by reducing our food import bill by 25% by the year 2025. Where is this person living? But what is more important, Mr. Speaker, sir, is that it goes on to say, at the same time, our government must provide solid support for our farmers to help reduce their costs and the cost of their products. Well, I am saying thank you for the article. I am saying well written. I appreciate stuff like this. But I will go a little further to say, please make sure you do not convey the wrong impression by neglecting to include what the government is already doing so that the public can then do their own analysis of the situation. But for you to leave it, for people to assume that these things are not being done, is wrong. And the cerebral that I know this person is capable of, sir, I know that there's more in the mortar than the pestle. And Mr. Speaker, I am saying so because it finishes like this, and all of us in this honorable chamber should take note. When they came for the bondholders demanding a haircut, you did not speak out because you were not a bondholder. When they came for the small contractors by importing cheap Chinese housing, you did not speak out because you were not a small contractor. When they came for the farmers by changing commercial water rates for their irrigation water and importing cheap food, you did not speak out because you were not a farmer. When they come for the pensioners, and they are coming in brackets, you will not speak out because you are not a pensioner. Yet when they come for you, who will be left to speak for you? Now there is the mischief in this. To my mind, a piece of writing that is designed to create mischief in this country. Commercial water rates in Barbados, everybody knows, were $4.66 per cubic meter. We all also know that there was not an across-the-board agricultural rate as there is now for $1.80. We also know that the rate of 60 cents or 66 cents per cubic meter was not sustainable at a time when you're asking the government to do more for farmers. So if the government is supposed to do more for farmers, how is it going to be financed? And nobody is telling me yet what I know in principle should be the approach to all of this. And that is how to make those farmers that are not real businessmen, serious businessmen. Because you must understand investment. And you must understand that this is not a case where you draw down money, you blow it, and then you wait for the government to come again with another handful. This is not the approach. And so I wish, Mr. Speaker, sir, that when people speak to what is happening in agriculture in this sector, that they either get the facts or they state exactly what their intention is. Because I do not know for the life of me how you can tell me that a fella is paying $4.66 for water, as high as $7.66, but another fella is paying 60 cents. And that is okay by your conscience. And I ask myself, where is the conscience of anyone who would expect us to continue to see the government put in all support for farming in Barbados, but yet still it is being conveyed in a manner like if nothing is being done. And I come back, Mr. Speaker, now to the debate that took place in November 2017, when the minister said, if they're thieving, let me lock them up. That's the approach. And therefore, to suggest that because you do not have a proper operating system, that because you don't have structure, that when you take your produce to market and you're not able to prove at the time that it is yours, you should be arrested and your produce confiscated. That is what was intended here. And the response that came from the honorable member at the time from St. Lucie was suggested that if the wardens are not empowered to arrest, all we gotta do is start training them, but they're arresting people already. That is the madness that we were dealing with, Mr. Speaker. the former honorable member for St. Lucie. I hope, well, but he's history now, though. I know that. I know that for as long as the honorable member who's currently here is there, that former honorable member will not see this place again. But, Mr. Speaker, I am talking about that lost decade when, if anything could go wrong, it went wrong then. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking about recklessness. Where, even in the presentation, the comments are being made about a predatory hotline. We have a predatory hotline at the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. Do we have a predatory hotline that works? I am speaking out loud. I ain't speaking to no gallery. Do we have a predatory desk established anywhere in the ministry? I ain't canceled none. And I have never been introduced to anyone at a predatory desk. But all this was suggested as what is being done. And then, Mr. Speaker, he goes on to suggest that whatever he's doing under this legislation is to protect people from getting dangerous food, harmful food, food that has been contaminated, which really is food safety legislation. And then, Mr. Speaker, it took for the leader of the opposition to come and explain to the then minister the difference between a Barbados Labour Party approach to this matter. And that the Barbados Labour Party could not, in good conscience, support what is taking place in the legislation that was before the Honourable Chamber. And Mr. Speaker, do you know, Mr. Speaker, that we're talking about agriculture produce, and in the legislation, sugarcane wasn't included? I believe that that same administration, well, I understand why they did it, because they hadn't paid the people since 2016. So as far as they were concerned, the sugar industry was not agriculture. But sugar cane was not included. And I will seek, Mr. Speaker, to find for you those other crops that were not included as well, that were excluded, Honourable Member for Christchurch East, that were excluded from the list. And if you will bear with me, Mr. Speaker, I will get to them quickly. Sugarcane culinary herbs. Herbs. All of us, you can't eat a piece of fish without seasoning, piece of chicken without seasoning. Livestock, poultry, planting material, freshwater fish for human consumption were all not handled properly under this legislation. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I believe that when we come now to the legislation itself, you start to understand what we did in order for us to anchor this legislation and to help Barbadians to be saved from being charged or penalized for wanting to survive in this country. So, Mr. Speaker, Section 1 of the Act, this section identifies the name by which the legislation may be cited, and that is the Protection of Agricultural Products Act 2022. Section 2 with the interpretation. This section outlines the definition of key terms used throughout the Act for the purpose of administering the Act. And they are worthy of mention is the expanded definition of agricultural products to include sugarcane and culinary herbs, and then the broader definition of livestock, which was not part of the Act. And at Section 3, which involves transaction, it describes the conditions under which a person shall, 1, purchase or obtain commercial quantities of agricultural produce, and this is by way of a receipt, a delivery note, or a bill of lading. And of course, it also seeks to deal with how the person sell or dispose of agricultural produce, again through a receipt, delivery note, or bill of lading, which must be given to the purchaser. It also improves the purchaser or receiver or their representative must make a distinction between, there is a distinction now between commercial quantities and quantities that are not deemed to be commercial. And then the purchaser or receiver, when receiving commercial quantities of agricultural products, to present to a designated police station within, if found, the purchaser must present to the police station within 24 hours. On the request of a police, the said documents received from the seller as proof of purchase or conveyance. So that if you purchase goods and you receive your receipt, bill of lading, and you were stopped by a police officer and asked to produce them, and you didn't at the time, you were given 24 hours. If the police need additional evidence of purchase, that also must be satisfied. Now, failure to comply with all of these is where penalties are introduced. And in our consultation with the stakeholders and with all of those who sent feedback to us, they felt that there must be stiffer penalties in order for there to be a deterrent for people engaging in petty larceny. So a person who is summarily convicted and will be fined $5,000 for not having the documents as required as proof of purchase. And also there's a fine of $10,000 for 1, not issuing said documents to purchaser or receiver and the products under consideration, and 2, not retaining evidence of purchase or conveyance and presenting same to police officer on request, and 3, not presenting evidence of purchase or conveyance to a designated police station within 24 hours of being asked to do so by the police officer. So that you're not now criminalizing people. What you're simply doing is giving everybody a chance to be able to prove that these items were legitimately obtained, and that you're not just walking around and asking people through wardens who had no power of arrest to produce information to these wardens, or else you're going to be arrested. There's also, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity now, and there's a distinction now between imported goods, where those goods should be supported also by a bill of lading, receipt, delivery note, or any other evidence. And then there's a penalty for people who falsify documents. All of us know that once people are involved in petty larceny, and they don't intend to stop, that at some point in time, they will attempt to beat the system. And there is a penalty for doing so, and there's a fine of $10,000 or 5 years in prison for anybody who commits fraud by falsifying documents. And then Section 7, which deals with stolen agricultural products. And this is where all of the farmers were adamant. All of the stakeholders were adamant. The BAS, all of the farming organizations, everyone. They were adamant that the penalties were not stiff enough and that people were only getting a slap on the wrist. And therefore, the recommendation was for the fine, once convicted, to go to $100,000 or 5 years imprisonment or both. These, Mr. Speaker, should serve as a deterrent for people who engage in predatory larceny. In terms of enforcement, Mr. Speaker, Section 8 makes provision for possible arrest and charging of a person by a police officer without a warrant, a police officer to stop a vehicle and conduct searches without a warrant, where that officer has reasonable grounds to suspect the person is in contravention of the act. Our police officer to request from the person in charge of a vehicle that was searched proof of ownership of commercial quantities of agricultural products found in the vehicle during the search. And Mr. Speaker, this is what policemen do, not wardens. And I'm emphasizing that because there is a difference. Mr. Speaker, these are the areas that were contentious. These are the areas in the act, Mr. Speaker, that created a humbug, because if left the way they were, then we would find ourselves in utter chaos in this country. And I'm saying this now, and I'm speaking to you, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking to this honorable chamber as a person who grew up in a village. And I understand what it is to rough it. I understand what it is sometimes to have no food. But I also understand what I saw as a boy growing up, where struggle led people to do all kinds of creative things, thinking that they were right and they were not. And Mr. Speaker, it would hurt me immensely if a youngster from Chapelan in St. Philip or from Church Village in St. Philip innocently took goods from a farmer to take to the mini-mart up the road and was stopped by a warden, could not produce proof of purchase, could not produce proof of ownership, and then would have to go to District C police station or wherever the warden is going to take them, because I don't know where the warden would take them anyhow. And that warden then must start by giving that person all the legal headache they can possibly get to prove that they're innocent. That is where I had a problem, sir. I have a problem also, sir, that if, in fact, you went to Chapel Plantation and they didn't have a certificate for you to take those goods and to give to you, because the government printery didn't have certificates, the Ministry of Agriculture didn't have certificates, but they still had to do business. So they gave you the produce, and then that person runs into a problem because of a system like that. Anybody can produce a receipt. You can get easily your own customized receipts at your plantation. You can get easily as a vendor your own customized receipts, and therefore you would have eliminated the challenge of waiting for the minister to produce certificates. Also, Mr. Speaker, I am not convinced that we want to go to a system where a minister by instrument can empower somebody to arrest. And the moment that we reach that stage, I know the honorable member for St. Michael East will go ballistic, because He's a champion of the poor man. Well, we all are. Thank you, Honourable Member for St. Michael, South Central. And I would hurt, Mr. Speaker, you know why it would hurt? Because I grew up with them boys in Church Village and Chapel Land and in Clifden. And they're all good people, you know, all good people. And if we put systems in place that invariably will make criminals out of them, I think we are the ones that will be failing. And what that bill in 2017 represented a massive failure on the part of the minister then to address a problem that dealt with people who were stealing crops and not necessarily people who were producing crops or people who innocently obtained crops or people who innocently obtained livestock or who were rearing livestock. Mr. Speaker, we are now working with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, to introduce a chip system for livestock so then that you can have a traceability right through. And that work is being done with the Ministry of Agriculture and the FAO. And then we are also looking at how we can use young people to look at creative ways of introducing a system for traceability. The medicinal cannabis industry is already looking at it. They have already engaged a consultant. And we are going to do the same for crops as well. But truth be told, when I went to Alibaba in China, these traceability systems spoke specifically to food safety, where you needed to know when the food was harvested, which farm it came from, what is the shelf life, the freshness of the produce, etc., up to a certain point, and at what point in time they take it off the shelf and dump it or destroy it. So even when I met with the Chinese in discussing this legislation and seeking to find out from them how I can come up with what the then minister was speaking about traceability, they also suggested to me that traceability is more suitable for food safety. And so the traceability that we are talking about here speaks exactly to electronic devices like electronic receipt, a barcode, and those types of things that you would use in order for us to be able to trace crops that came from either farm gate or from a vendor or even from a supermarket or from a small farmer. But you're not going to get a situation where a small farmer is going to be able to invest in all these things. And that's the reason why we are not making it mandatory for farmers to be registered, and that we are not stopping them from being protected under this legislation because they are not registered. And under the previous legislation, they wanted every single farmer to be registered, and there must be a registry at the ministry being kept by the chief agriculture officer. And if you're not captured there, then you're not protected by the law. That we have also changed, Mr. Speaker. You do not have to be registered in order to be protected by the law. Mr. Speaker, I believe that as it relates to stolen goods that are taken, that the legislation was going in the right direction, where the goods would be held by the chief agricultural officer. They could either be returned to the identified owner or be sold. And if they're perishable goods, then the chief agricultural officer can dispose of those goods and an arrangement be made for reimbursement. So that, to my mind, was going in the right direction. I have fundamentally no problems with that. And then, Mr. Speaker, I believe the rest of the legislation in terms of now having quantities that are deemed to be commercial quantities of agricultural produce would allow for us then to be able to determine what is a commercial quantity and whether or not you want to confuse a person simply because they're carrying agricultural produce and not a commercial quantity. Equally, Mr. Speaker, because of the receipt system, you're not going to humbug vendors, but we just passed contemporary vending legislation because the last settled legislation attempted to criminalize vendors. And this Barbados Labour Party administration committed to the decriminalization of vendors, and we did that. So that vendors are not now being made criminals for wanting to sell in a space somewhere. Proper vending zones will be created, and the vendors will be able to ply their trade without being harassed by anyone. So that we have already fixed that under the new suite of legislation for vending in Barbados that seek to decriminalize vending in this country. Now, Mr. Speaker, I like to stay away from things that can cause people to misinterpret me. And therefore, there are several things that have been said when we were discussing this legislation in public, and there are things that were completely misunderstood. Now, I hear people targeting fellows who sell sugarcane. I ain't targeting nobody. I am putting a system in place where you can show where you got the sugarcane from. And you don't necessarily have to be a planter. You can purchase. And therefore, I strongly believe that all of this fingering that we engage in this country on a daily basis, a fella standing up at the roundabout selling sugarcane, he's being fingered. You point out, he's a thief. You can't do those things to innocent people. And Mr. Speaker, I'm serious, you know. If we can keep this simple, everybody's likely to participate, you know. It is when we make it more complex than what it should be that then we start to create problems and a humbug for people. And I am suggesting, Mr. Speaker, sir, that all vendors will now be on board. We have had the full support of the president of Barvin when we did this consultation. And Mr. Speaker, he is on board, they are on board. It is a question now of how we are going to execute this to make sure people can follow the system. And I strongly believe that the onus is on all Barbadians to determine who they're going to purchase from based on the structure that we have here. That if the person cannot produce for you a receipt, if the person cannot show their proof of ownership or purchase, that you should cease and desist. And that, Mr. Speaker, with the PSAs that we are going to be doing, and the way we are seeking then to roll out how we are going to manage farming and our farming communities and stakeholders so that they too can comply and become compliant with the system, I strongly believe that this is doable, and it takes away the attempts at making criminals out of people, calling people thieves and saying to lock them up if they're thieving. Those things are wrong, Mr. Speaker. And I am confident that my team, along with the CPC, are going in the right direction with this legislation. And I am convinced, Mr. Speaker, that the results, especially for the farming community, for those people who were the victims of prairie larceny, that they now can feel a little more comfortable, and that with the introduction of the technology, that we should be able to do a better job at enforcing. And so, Mr. Speaker, I wish to commend this legislation to this honorable chamber. And I wish to ask I wish to ask that we, all of us, acknowledge where we are seeking to take Barbadians in terms of, one, building out an agricultural sector. Honourable Member for St. Joseph, I ain't finished yet. Building out the sector by way of putting systems in place. Now, the first thing I can hear, right, when I'm finished, the first thing I'm going to hear is that we talking about production and we ain't telling anybody how the people can sell the crops, and that we are talking about production and where you're going to store all these things if they're stolen. All these things I'm going to hear. So I want to make it abundantly clear and place on record that we are now creating storage capacity through the Barbados-Ghana Food Terminal that will give us an opportunity to hold 40 20-foot containers, 20-foot containers at that facility, and that at the same time we can increase the capacity, that we are going to be using storage, contemporary storage facilities, Mr. Speaker, where you can use blast freezing and chilling and waxing as well, so that we can hold produce over a period of time. Now, onions is a crop that we produce in Barbados, but I don't think we've ever reached full capacity with onions because of the issues with storage, etc. Iron is a crop that you have to dry. So we're also putting that system in place through the BADMC to be able to do the drying, but to store more onions in Barbados and ramp up onion production in this country as well. And then, Mr. Speaker, we have started the process to increase our black belly sheep. We have already started the process with Guyana, where we are going to be doing the hybrid crossing of the sheep to give us a better, a bigger animal. And then we are also going to use the same system in Barbados to ramp up production, Mr. Speaker. We are well on the way with our aquaculture project, which the BADMC is doing, so that by next year we will also be producing our own shrimp, our prawns, and we will also be producing our freshwater fish. These will give people an opportunity to participate at various levels in agriculture. But if, Mr. Speaker, you thought that we were just looking at the commercial aspects of it, we are not. And so I've asked for the ministry to come up with a program that gives us an opportunity to include Barbadians getting back to kitchen gardens and community gardens. And that is where we are going with Project Care, where Barbadians will literally be able to grow their own food with the assistance of the ministry through its agencies, the BAMC and the BADMC. We have a few model projects that we are going to show to the country, and they are growing a variety of crops. We are working now with Dr. Chelston Braffett, who used to be Director General at ICA, to produce small aquaponic farms where you're growing your fruits and vegetables on one level, and then you have your fish farm on the other level, and the nitrates from the fishing can go to feed the crops. And those will be part of Project Care. The chairman, who happens to be the Honourable Member for St. Michael East, is working with the rest of the team for us to get Project Care up and running. This is gonna give Barbadians a chance to be able to eat healthy food. And I spoke to this on numerous occasions when I mentioned that if we are going to change the palates of our young people, we must do so knowing full well that we take responsibility for what they find at home. And if a child comes home and that child can find a banana, some grapes, a strawberry, a golden apple, an avocado, a mango, just like how I used to know it, then that child will consume those. But if a child comes home to all the unhealthy packaged foods processed foods, fast food, that child wouldn't know any different, and so it would develop a palate for those. And that is where we will continue to get our NCDs. And therefore, with Project CARE, just think of the man or woman or child who invariably would not have been able to get something as simple as vegetables with a meal on a frequent or daily basis. That family can now have vegetables on a frequent or daily basis. And that if we are speaking to food security, which a lot of people get wrong, food security is about the daily availability of food, but not just food, but wholesome food. Because you can have the daily availability of all starches or all fast food, and that really and truly is not food security. Food security also speaks to people being able to access food at a reasonable price so that they can afford to purchase food for daily consumption. And food security is about healthy eating as well, where people eat healthy food, and we are able then to combat a lot of the NCDs that we are seeing. People get this wrong, and I understand why people get it wrong. But again, that is part of an education process where we will need then to zoom in on what we are sharing with the public in order for us to be able to address issues of food security and indeed food sovereignty, simply because you should know what is being applied to the crops, what pesticides are being used, and how those foods are being processed as well and packaged. So yes, I agree that we must also know what is going into our foods. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that the work at the ministry in being able to establish medicinal cannabis legislation to give people a new industry in this country, where we have now issued licenses to Barbadians first and foremost, that we are seeking now to carve out an ecosystem for Barbadians to become owners, just like the model we use with the sugar industry, where Barbadians can literally own the entire industry, and the government would give them the start and then transition out of the system, allowing for them to own it. And the medicinal cannabis industry is moving along. We've had our slowdown periods between 2020 and 2021, and in 2022 we were able to issue licenses to 2 Barbadians to the value of just about $1.5 million in license fees. And there are several others that we are waiting to approve as well. I want to see Barbadians owning the medicinal cannabis industry, and I'm pleased that we were able to grant those licenses to Barbadians. So far, we do not have any international investors getting licenses, but may I remind everybody that our industry has a 30% carve-out for Barbadian ownership and international investment as well. So however you look at it, Barbadians will be part of the ownership structure. And then, Mr. Speaker, we have had battles upon battles with the unions of Barbados in terms of facilities for farmers. And we have answered the call and are now providing proper bathroom facilities on farms where laborers on the farms can have a convenient way of answering nature's call. And at the same time, proper facilities for having lunch. They can have charging ports for the mobile phones, and the facilities are driven by solar voltaic energy. So we have done that as well. So our people don't have to resort to going in the bush in order to answer nature's call. And we have also, Mr. Speaker, improved the husbandry practices upon all of the farms, making it mandatory for farmers to follow certain husbandry practices in order for them to receive the incentives. And then we have been paying all of our bills to the farmers on time. This is a complete turnaround in agriculture. We will continue to press on, but all of what we're doing justifies why we have to get this legislation here, so that we can also provide the necessary protection for our farmers. And Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Honourable Member for St. Michael North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, sir, for the opportunity to make a brief intervention on the bill that is before the House, the Protection of Agricultural Products Bill. I first want to commend the Honourable Member for St. Philip South, the Minister responsible for agriculture, for his presentation and for laying this bill in the House this morning, and for the advancements that are taking place under his charge. Mr. Speaker, sir, he would have outlined for us the fact that many attempts have been made to address this issue of predial larceny over the years. 2 legislative attempts in particular were made, and they unfortunately fell short in one way or the other. And today, as we debate this bill, this is our government's attempt and effort to correct the deficiencies that were identified in those 2 previous legislative efforts, to protect what we can consider and what we have acknowledged as a government as one of our most critical sectors, that is, our farmers. Mr. Speaker, sir, I do not have to remind the members of this House, this honorable House, of the importance of the role played by farmers, especially as it relates to what we experienced over the last 2 years in the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, I remember driving along the highways and byways of our country, and something that was probably never thought to be possible. To see, Mr. Speaker, men and women, children standing up in long lines by roadside vendors and market vendors to purchase produce and fruits and vegetables from our local suppliers. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Speaker, the importance of nutritious meals was borne out, and many of our citizens found their way to the various roadside vendors, the various markets across the length and breadth of our country to be able to make purchases of their fruits and the vegetables to build up their immunity and to ensure that their family had nutritious and sumptuous meals for which to consume and to keep themselves as safe as possible from the COVID-19 virus. So during that time, it really elevated and highlighted and underscored the importance of our farmers. The need for us now, therefore, Mr. Speaker, to bring legislation that will protect them cannot be understated. Mr. Speaker, sir, the member who last spoke, as the Minister responsible for agriculture, has been leading the charge to bring our country into the realm of not only food security, but food sovereignty. And he would have done a good job of explaining to us the difference between food security and food safety. And we understand, Mr. Speaker, that those who held these posts before, former ministers of agriculture, who are thankfully no longer in this place, would not have even understood the distinction between those terms. And therefore, we are not surprised by the failings that they would have demonstrated in their duties. But Mr. Speaker, as I began to think about predial larceny and my interaction with this topic, as I was composing myself and preparing myself to support the Honourable Member for St. Philip South. I remember as a little boy in Eden Lodge, 2G Nursery Lane, Eden Lodge, St. Michael to be exact, I remember looking outside my door on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, and I would see, as a very young child, I would see those vendors, those guys passing through my gap with stalks and stalks of cane, sugar cane on their head, bound by a rope. And they would pass through, Mr. Speaker, the gap, and my mother and many of my neighbors would go out and they would buy many a stalk of sugar cane, and they would sit on the step and they would peel it, and we would have fun, eating it. This is my first really memory of interacting with agricultural products. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, my mother would take us, I would say, not use the word take, let me retract that. My mother would drag us down to the Cheapside Market. I remember the Cheapside Market very well, all on the inside and outside, all along the road. There was vendors galore selling herbs and produce. Those were my early memories of interacting with vendors, interacting with agricultural products. I did not understand what predial larceny was. I did not understand how the man who was selling the sugar cane in my gap came to acquire the sugar cane. I didn't understand. I didn't know. I just accepted it. But predial larceny, as I have grown to understand, has been a major problem in our society for many a decade, many, many years, Mr. Speaker. As I grew up and as I matured and as I came into the world of work, etc., I began to hear about the plight of many vendors, many farmers. And Mr. Speaker, we must not remove ourselves or detach ourselves from the impact of predial larceny on those farmers. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, you invest your blood, your sweat, your tears, your money into plowing up a piece of land, into planting various seeds of whatever crop it is, investing the time and energy, the water, everything, pouring your efforts into this product or products. And just when your product is reaching the stage of being ripe and ready to be harvested, you come out the next morning and find hallowed grounds. You come out and find holes in the ground. You come out and find pens that have been raided. Mr. Speaker, I've heard accounts of farmers who came out and found their cows, their cattle, their sheep butchered on the spot. Butchered on the spot. Can you imagine the pain and the anguish of our farmers who for many years have invested their efforts into rearing animals and producing crops, only to be surrounded, only then to find that somebody else comes and steals the fruit of their labors. This is what this bill is about this morning, Mr. Speaker. This is about protecting those who are in the area of producing agricultural products for our country, for their own livelihood, of course, first and foremost, but even as COVID-19 has taught us, for the rest of us as people in this Barbados, so we too can have access of the fruit of their labors. It is not fair, Mr. Speaker, that after persons would put in all of this effort, that someone else could reap the rewards and the benefits. This issue of predial larceny has bewildered many an administration. As I said, those previous attempts dating back even to 2017, the last one, were made in an effort to address this issue, but they were done in such a haphazard and ineffective way, ineffectual manner, that unfortunately the issue continues to this day. But our administration, this Barbados Labour Party administration, has heard the cries of our farmers. We have listened to the various stakeholders. The Honourable Member who just spoke would have said how we would have engaged all of the various stakeholders in this regard, from the BAS to the farmers themselves. We have taken the time to listen to them. We have heard, and we have now brought legislation today that can address and protect the farmers of Barbados. I want to go now to the bill, Mr. Speaker, because I wanted this intervention to be very brief today. I'm sure that there are many other members today that want to contribute to it, as it is a very important and substantive piece of legislation. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, the bill makes clear very very clear certain definitions. In particular, we want to focus on a few of them: agricultural products. And many persons who are listening to this debate may be wondering, what are agricultural? The bill makes it clear. And it says that all products that are grown in or on land that is produced for the purpose of human consumption, for forage, products cultivated for animals. So it starts out by defining what an agricultural product is. In this 2022 bill, we have expanded this definition now to include, as the Honourable Member would have mentioned, something that was a glaring oversight before: sugarcane, culinary herbs, livestock. Mr. Speaker, how could you have protection of agricultural products and not include livestock? A joke. We have now expanded to include that. What else have we included, Mr. Speaker? We have now included freshwater fish for human consumption. Why is this important? Because the Honourable Member who last spoke would have made it very clear that we are now opening even new industries for the people of Barbados relative to farming of fresh fish, prawns and shrimp and other things like that. Mr. Speaker, opportunities abound in the area of agriculture, and it's a shame that previous ministers of agriculture did not see or did not have a vision, but we have a minister right now who has a vision and has a plan for agriculture. And in this bill, Mr. Speaker, we also better define what commercial quantities mean. And this is an important definition, Mr. Speaker, because if you don't know what a commercial quantity is, you are liable to contravene the legislation when passed. So it's important, Mr. Speaker, that all of us understand what those commercial quantities are. And within the context of this proposed legislation today, it means the value or the quantity of agricultural products as set out in the attached schedule. And that schedule makes it very clear what those quantities are for the range of products that are available to us here in Barbados. So there can be no ambiguity, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to what is covered under this legislation and what is not, what quantum and the requirements under which you must apply yourself to ensuring that you do not contravene this bill once passed and becomes an act. For example, Mr. Speaker, if a person is seeking to sell or even give away, you may have a small piece of land, you may have your kitchen garden, and you produce some potatoes, you may produce some edibles and some yams, bananas even. And you want to give them away to your family as is your custom. As long, Mr. Speaker, as it is less than 25 kilograms, you're good to go. No problem. Less than 25 kilograms, no issues. But once you get to 25 and over, you now have to make sure you adhere to the requirements that have been outlined within this legislation. In that case, Mr. Speaker, you will be required to issue a receipt or a bill of lading, a delivery note to that recipient of that produce, so that proof of ownership can be established. Mr. Speaker, we are addressing and seeking to address predial larceny, and that is a case where you cannot prove where you got your items from. And we want in this legislation to strengthen and protect the farmers of Barbados, so that when people receive stolen goods or receive things that they do not know the origins thereof, they now need to ask themselves and ask of that provider some questions relative to the proof of ownership. That's what this legislation is about. Some people among us in our society think it fitting, Mr. Speaker, that they can go about and steal the fruit of others' labors. But it takes two hands to clap. It is not just the person who goes into the field in the dark of night and takes up the person's produce or takes up the person's animals and livestock, Mr. Speaker. It is the other persons who are on the other side of this transaction. And the Honourable Member called it organized crime, basically, where persons are now making a racket out of predial larceny. Those going into the field or finding willing people who will take those products and then go into various markets and go into various places and distribute those goods to unsuspecting market vendors and, of course, to the general public. Well, going forward, Mr. Speaker, if you're seeking to sell quantities in excess of those that are listed in the schedule, you will need to satisfy the requirements of burden of proof, where you will have to show your receipts. If you're in possession of those goods, you have to prove by show of a receipt where you would have paid money to receive those goods. And we are not unfair, Mr. Speaker. If a person at the point in time when a member of the Barbados Police Service stops you, pulls you over, interacts with you at your stall, says to you, where did you get these things from? And you're not in that very same moment able to produce the receipts that are required, you have 24 hours. 24 hours within which to get those receipts, to get that proof of ownership, proof of purchase to the requisite police station. This administration, Mr. Speaker, is serious about reducing this scourge called predial larceny. This bill covers not only producers and sellers, but it goes so far as to deal with importers as well of agricultural products. Mr. Speaker, the fines and penalties for not being able to prove ownership, Mr. Speaker, we have bolstered that. We have taken the fines and we have moved them from a minimum of $5,000 up to $100,000, and there's also the possibility, Mr. Speaker, that you can also serve some time in our prison, up to 5 years. Mr. Speaker, we are not joking around with this thing anymore. We can no longer allow this scourge to continue in a civilized, progressive society. It has to stop. No one should feel it is their right to go into somebody else's grounds, their pens, and take up things that do not belong to them. If you are found with them, Mr. Speaker, you will be facing the potential fines of up to $100,000 or 5 years in the prison cell. 5 years in the prison cell. It does not pay, Mr. Speaker, you know this quite well from your profession. It does not pay to do crime. It does not pay to do crime. If we do things the right way, all of us will be able to benefit in this society. The legislation gives members of the Barbados Police Service the legal right and authority to question individuals relative to providing or proving their rightful ownership of the produce in their possession. And Mr. Speaker, as I wind up, this is something that the police service did not have before. They had to go through all sorts of crazy mechanisms and jump through all sorts of hoops, wardens and this thing and a registry and all sorts of nonsense that would not have been able, I don't know if I can say nonsense, but anyway, things that hoops that they had to jump through that would have made it, pardon? A humbug, a nuisance, an annoyance. And ultimately, because of all of those hoops you had to jump through and all the humbug, no one would ever have been able to really been prosecuted for this crime before. But now we are making strides, significant strides, Mr. Speaker, to correct this issue and to put teeth into the legislation, to put authority into the hands of our Barbados Police Service, so that now we can really police, monitor, and control this scourge and reduce this scourge and ultimately, Mr. Speaker, to eliminate this scourge called predial larceny. So, Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, we need this to cease. I want to speak to every citizen in our country. It is important that as we go forward as a civilized society that we work together. It is not right for us to try to tear down others thinking that we can lift ourselves up. And this applies not only to predial larceny and to the protection of agricultural products, but in every sphere of our existence as Barbadians. We have to come together and work together as one. There's absolutely no reason why a person, if you see a farmer getting through, go and offer help to contribute to his success or her success, man. Make an effort to work with that farmer. Make a contribution that is positive to his or her attempts and efforts. And then ultimately you will be able to share in the bounty as well. But we will not, as a government, allow for a system to exist and be maintained and obtained where people can, with immunity and impunity, think that they can get away with this thing and go and take as they like. It must stop. And I speak to every citizen, please stop it. This legislation has my full support, Mr. Speaker. The member for St. Philip South has my full support and that of the government. And we look forward, Mr. Speaker, to continue to build out this space of agriculture so that not only creative opportunities are created for our people from a revenue perspective, but also that we as a country can continue to have food security and food sovereignty. With these few words, Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged. Thank you.
Honourable St. Michael's of Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, my mother was a small farmer. And perhaps she is a part of the reason that I have myself such an interest in farming. And as some of my colleagues will now know, an interest in black belly sheep in particular. I used to have to get up at hours that no primary school child probably should have to get up and go and stake out sheep. And as those of us who had that task would know, sheep love to cause chaos. They run around in circles. There are many times that they got wrapped up around my feet and I toppled over. Had to go and cut meat. And at that time, I don't know how they do it now. At that time, we had to use a sift or a sickle, as you would call it. I don't even know if people know what that looks like now. And go and cut meat from the side of the road and tie it up and bring it back. How many ants' nests I stepped in. But it perhaps laid the foundation for my interest in farming. They say, sir, that the first economists were farmers. And I might put it another way by saying that farmers are the original economists. Because, as I always say in this place, economics is about provisioning to people. And we now appreciate the broader understanding of economics, which is about keeping resources and ecosystems in balance for the sustainability of all life and livelihoods. That's what economics is. That's what farming is. That's what being responsible for the food and nutrition security of an entire nation and contributing to the food and nutrition security of a region, that's what that is. And as the honourable member who spoke before me suggested, it is a huge contribution to civilization. It is not just about being a productive sector and generating economic activity, but keeping us all alive. And that is why we take these matters so seriously. But sir, apart from the story of how my mother's small farming was able to literally keep food on the table for us, we didn't do fancy salads when I was growing up. My mother would send us to get some lettuce, put the lettuce in the middle of the table and break off one by one, like how people break off bread and eat. And that is the way that we ate a lot of our vegetables. And a lot of the resources that we use to help us with some of the activities that we did as children, we could not have done without the income that my mother made from small farming. I watched my mother pick spinach that grew over the paling, put it in large garbage bags, and catch a bus, 2 buses, to have to take that produce to the supermarket. And if somebody had come before she was able to harvest and taken that, then there were many tours to Andromeda Gardens or to Otterson House or whatever that we would not have gone on. because my mother used those resources to help supplement our educational experience, because there's a lot of education that does not just happen in the classroom, and there are a lot of resources that parents need to find that are not met by the state. But sir, I want to tell you another story. Not from my childhood this time, but more recent. A story of a Bajan farmer and his experience over this recent crop over, this last crop over weekend. And he got up one of the mornings over that weekend to find that 2 of his sires, his serving rams, had been stolen. Now, it took some time for him to also discover that some of the ewes had been taken, some of the equipment had been taken. He called the police, and it being last lap crop over weekend, the police found themselves not in a position to respond because all resources had been deployed to the various crop over events. And we understand as well that given the recent concerns with safety and security, I would imagine that these are concerns we have every year, that those resources were needed at that time. But I regret to say that actually to this day, he has not been able to make a report because the police have not responded. And we know that crop over has finished some time now. Sir, when I heard from him about that experience, having an interest as I do in black belly sheep farming and in the genetic project in which Barbados is engaged, and in the work on the stock and making sure that we're able to breed a better, larger, higher quality animal with whose meat that is eventually produced is very competitive on global markets. I felt deflated. And I could only imagine, given all of his decades of work, including with some of the farmers from Greenland and the work that they're doing on black belly sheep at the Greenland project, I could not even imagine how dejected and completely forlorn he felt. Because, sir, the value of livestock in particular is not just about the meat or the carcass, but is about the breeding of future progeny, is about the genetics, and an environment where we are trying to develop the best black belly sheep stock, and in an environment where this is a target of the ministry of the country of this region, there has been tremendous value that has been lost by that theft. So I'm happy to hear, sir, about the rapid response unit that will be placed in the Barbados Police Service. Because I dare say that if that farmer had gotten a more immediate response, there may have been some capacity for tracking of the offenders that may have meant that he may have been able to recover 1 or 2, if not all, of the animals that had been taken. But I will be equally happy, sir, to see or to hear where the resources for that unit will be allocated in the estimates of expenditure, because it seems to me that it cannot be a question of taking resources, current resources from the Barbados Police Service and creating a rapid response unit for this purpose. Because we know, and we experience every day, how constrained the Barbados Police Service is with all of the different areas of enforcement that they're called upon to fulfill. We have enforcement requirements across every area of legislation. We have enforcement requirements when it comes to planning. And as I stand here and I can see the member for St. George North, who for sure may have take exception to some of the enforcement capacity from the Planning and Development Department as it relates to monitoring the activities of a certain dump site close to where she has responsibility for. The enforcement constraints of the Barbados Police Service and of all of the agencies of government are real. And it is not for absence of political will. It is not for absence of will on the part of the police service. It is absence of resources. If I hear of or know of an incident of animal cruelty, I can't just show up and demand the people surrender the animal to me. I have to go with a police officer. And every day, the Barbados Police Service has to make decisions about what is a more critical response. Whether it is to go and track down sheep, or it is to respond to a crime of a violent nature. Now, those two things occupy important places. But it is a decision when it is a question of scarce resources. So when it comes to the Rapid Response Unit in the Barbados Police Service for this purpose, we have to make sure that we allocate the new resources. And we aren't drawing from current resources because that's going to shift the problem from one sector to another. One of my concerns, sir, with respect to the legislation, and I'm sure that when others speak and when the honourable member who introduced this bill closes, he will perhaps point to some part that I have missed or some part that is captured, or how this is captured in some part of the legislation that I do not appreciate. And so I will be happy to be corrected. But it seems to me that the legislation speaks primarily to what we understand to be standard commercial transactions. The question of buying and selling. But we really need, I believe, to address all of the circumstances under which agricultural products may enter into the custody of others. And what do I mean by that? The way that the abattoir or even large commercial butchers will operate is that if a farmer is known to them and a farmer brings in an animal, they will say, okay, well, I know that farmer holder raises sheep, and this must be one of the sheep, and I will butcher the animal, and that's fine. And so that makes this legislation so important because I have to prove, and I hope that is contemplated to include butchers and abattoirs because they also take custody of agricultural products of livestock. But to be able to prove that this is my animal that I have reared or that I have purchased for the purpose of slaughter. Because at the point, you can't undo slaughtering an animal. So at the point that the animal has been slaughtered, then it is very difficult for me to get real restitution. So the question has to be less about pure commercial transactions as we understand them, buying and selling, but the question of custody. And when an animal, and forgive me for focusing in my intervention on livestock, sir, but when an animal happens to pass into the possession of another for whatever reason, then this very important work that the legislation is introducing, this very important measure of tracing and tracking and having to show that you have come honestly by this animal or by this product, then that also has to be introduced. So I think that the legislation must have a chain of custody approach and not just about domestic buying and selling and importing and exporting. And I'm sure that it is framed, or the honourable member will point out to me where it is framed to be able to account for that. But sir, as has been said, many of the thieves are themselves farmers. And so we have to make sure that every individual, I don't care how large and important your farm is, that every individual must be required to submit to the measures in this legislation. Now, the other part of what the Honourable Member for St. Philip South reinforced that is very important is the fact that legislation alone is not going to solve this issue. Legislation alone is not going to get us there. So I was very happy to hear about the measures that are contemplated with respect to tagging and with respect to electronic tagging and tracking. I think that this has to go hand in hand. It really has to be able to accompany what this legislation is trying to do. And I don't want us to get overwhelmed by the notion that it is too expensive. I'm happy to hear about the project with the Food and Agricultural Organization. I would be pleased to know when it is likely to start and the kind of coverage that it is likely to give us in terms of how many farmers can be included. Because I've done some of my own checking, and I was especially prompted to do some of my own checking when that farmer had that experience recently, to see what are some of the costing associated with this rice grain tagging that is now being used, where you introduce a single very, very small chip behind the ear of the animal, and you're able to say this animal, this is barcoded, it belongs to whichever farmer, and you're able to trace it that way. If we are able to introduce that alongside this legislation, I fear that this legislation will not have the power and the strength and the teeth that we would like it to have, because a system of electronic tagging and tracking is far more reliable than having a receipt that can be falsified. And we know that there's a penalty for falsification, but as I said, when my prize terminal sire is taken and slaughtered, then that's a wrap. For me to recover that, for even restitution to be made for that, I mean, the value that is lost, I am not sure that it can be easily addressed with any attempts at restitution. So I believe that this is something that we have to look at very, very closely. The fact that we can have chips implanted, the fact that we can have ear tagging that is done now, but the kind of ear tagging that means that you can only remove it, the only way that you can remove it will cause the ear to be ripped, as many know. And once I get an animal with a ripped ear, then I'm gonna start to ask questions. Well, where is this tag? And why was the tag removed? And explain to me why you cannot tell me where you got this animal. I think that the legislation is correct, and that the framers of the legislation are correct to not penalize a farmer who is not registered and to say that he or she is not offered protection under the legislation. I think that is correct. However, I want us to continue to encourage farmers to be registered and to make it so that that registration means something to the value that they get from the state. As farmers, I want to make sure that we register the lands on which farming is done, that we encourage people to register the storage facilities that they're using. Because if I, as a member of the Barbados Police Service, happen upon a storage facility with a certain number of carcasses and I don't know, or you haven't registered this storage facility as a farmer or as a butcher, then I want to know what is happening here. I think, as the Honourable Minister who introduced the bill has emphasized repeatedly, we have to come at this from several different angles. The legislation is a start, and it is an important start that remedies a lot of the problems with the last attempt at framing this legislation. But I think we also have, we have to make sure we don't psych ourselves out. We have to make sure that we don't tell ourselves this is too hard. Because I'm advised that in a place like Barbados, we really have the capacity, if we're talking about a large farm or a major farm in Barbados having somewhere around 600 sheep at a maximum, or 100 sows in the case of pigs, then it means that it is not prohibitive to tag all those animals. It is absolutely doable to tag all those animals. I was reading some reports from a farm in the Netherlands, and their system requires every single animal, and we are talking about tremendously large farms. We're talking about animals that roam over acres and acres, and their system requires you to tag every animal. And again, these are often questions of scale. And so if we are able to, as an area of functional cooperation with our colleagues in the region, to be able to introduce this technology such that we acquire it at scale, we deploy it at scale, then I believe, I haven't done all the numbers, just a little back of the envelope calculation, but I believe that it is absolutely doable. I think that the question of using drones is important, but I want us to appreciate, and I do not think it can be overstated, what the Honourable Member for St. Philip South tried to have us understand. This is organized crime. Some of these stories and some of the experiences I have myself had suggest to me that these are individuals who are themselves farmers, and that is perhaps the most hurtful part. These are people who themselves understand the pain of losing animals and losing crops. And they get together with others and organize because they have visited a farm and seen what others are able to do, decide they want it for themselves and they do not want to come to it by honest means. And that is why I even question the $100,000 fine or the 5 years imprisonment. Because some of these thieves are wealthy. They can easily pay $100,000 and go tomorrow and thief again. And so understanding that this comes down to $100,000, and I know that with respect to the setting of fines, we have to understand that we are dealing with people with different levels of economic capacity. That is important. But I believe that when it comes down to the discretion of the judge in the case, that some of these individuals we may have to imprison. And I'm talking about people of means. Because $100,000, first of all, does not even begin to match my opportunity cost from having lost a prize breeding ram. The offspring of that ram that I could have in the future and breed and breed and breed and be able to develop very valuable stock, the $100,000 doesn't begin to cover that. But apart from that, bearing in mind that these are individuals of means who themselves are very organized and have large vehicles and refrigerator trucks and all kinds of things to be able to go and slaughter and then move the meat. I mean, these things are sophisticated operations. And so I hope that for some of these cases, when we appreciate that an individual is a person of means for whom a $100,000 fine means nothing, that we set an example by perhaps introducing a penalty that they will feel more. So, sir, I do not have much to contribute in the way of big philosophical conversations. But I do have a lot of what I think are practical reflections. I am encouraged by the massive level of consultation that has gone on with the farming community with respect to this legislation. I think that for farming in particular, it is extremely important to listen to not just established farmers that are doing this as a productive endeavor, but also to small farmers. And I will say to you that there are things that my mother has learned and taught us about farming, that her mother learned and taught her about farming, that I believe that some commercial farmers don't know. And that means that she has been able to be extremely successful, even though doing it on a small scale. So I am encouraged that small farmers, large commercial farmers, vendors, all sectors of the population have been consulted. I would encourage us to continue to consult with those in the technology sector as well, who will be able to help us execute on this electronic tagging of animals so that I am not relying on a piece of paper that can be falsified, and that eventually I am able to have a database of these animals. In Barbados, it is eminently doable so that we can minimize this issue and have surety. I will say as well that when it comes to the question of how we hold some of the stolen goods in custody, that I do hope that there can be quick return if we are able to prove ownership, because I really would not like to know that in the case of livestock, that animals are being held, because I know how I treat my animals and I don't want anybody else responsible for feeding or otherwise handling them. So, sir, I feel pleased with the start that we have made. I congratulate the officers in the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Nutrition Security led by the Minister. As he has himself suggested, this is going to come down to the execution, and this is going to come down to being able to send the strongest signals to this underground market that exists, that we are no longer tolerating this. I equally congratulate the officers on the work that they have been doing in other areas of the sector, at different levels of the sector, including through the community farming. I and the people of St. Michael South Central are eagerly awaiting the start of the Pine Plantation Road farming project. I cannot wait for us to be able to see the containers that are to be delivered, so that rather than open farming, we can introduce some technology to that area, and so that people who live in the area are able to have access to the wherewithal to do farming. St. Michael people farm too. My mother raised us in Haggard Hall, and she was a farmer, and it meant that we were able to be raised on good food and go to school and learn, as she would often say. So, sir, with those words, I commend this bill, and I look forward to the continued work of the ministry in protecting our farmers and our livelihoods. Thank you.
Honourable Christmas East.
Mr. Speaker, I am about to do things a little bit differently today. I usually tend to try to expand upon the legal aspects of the bill and try to explain the legality, but my learned friend from St. Philip's South, sir, seems to have sometime recently taken a course in law, because he stripped down the legislation and pointed to the technicalities in a way that I don't have to do it. Sir, allow me to start by commending the Honourable Minister of Agriculture and the Honourable Member for St. Philip's South on not just this bill, but also the program, the comprehensive, aggressive agricultural program that he and his ministry and his officials have been conducting in and across Barbados. It is worthy of serious commendations. He can't pat himself on the back. But as we go, we had a problem with bush before, sir, and a lot of lands being overgrown. And what Minister Ford has not converted into botanical gardens, everything else has been plowed into agriculture. So in many areas where people had issues with overgrown lots and overgrown acres of government lands, a lot of these lands are into cultivation. So aggressive is the campaign by the Honourable Minister, sir, that my ministry had identified land on a map to do a project, and we went and saw it, sir. And 10 days later, I took everybody concerned to see exactly where we're going to do this project and build this bond. And sir, imagine my surprise when all of us, myself, my PS, some overseas persons, we all go to the area which had been identified and see the area within the 10 days since I last saw it under cultivation, plowed up and planted. I had some choice words from my friend at the time. But he said, if we are going to feed our country and feed our people, then we have to use all available land. And it was my fault because it was excess land. Although it didn't necessarily fall under him, I should have asked him a question so he didn't go and plow it up and plant it. We had to leave it, sir, and find someplace else. But that is the nature of the man. Sir, I find that we tend often to lose focus when we start to call things by names other than what they are. We get pretty, sir, with some terminology and don't realize what it is at its basis form. We call theft of crops predial larceny. And predial larceny, sir, then takes on its own persona. And we start to water it down a little bit. We start to say it's predial larceny, so this is not as bad as housebreaking. It's predial larceny, and this is not as bad as robbery. It's predial larceny, this is not as bad as snatching a handbag from a car. But sir, predial larceny is theft. It is theft and must be considered, viewed, responded to, and regarded, sir, in the way that we regard any other criminal enterprise or any other aspect of theft. It is theft of growing crops. People may think, well, nobody get hurt. But sir, sometimes nobody gets hurt only because nobody was there at the time. And if I have a shop, sir, and I have all these items hanging up in my shop, and I bought them. I purchased them from a supplier, I expended my money, I bought the stuff, I have it in my shop. And somebody breaks in that shop and carries away all. There'll be a public outcry in Barbados. Look how they rob the small man. Look how they rob the poor black businessman. But that same value of crops growing in a ground that I plowed a field and bought the seedlings and put the seedlings in and watered the seedlings and fertilized the seedlings and had pesticide for the seedlings and did all of the other things related to those seedlings and watched them grow. I had to time that harvest. I had to make sure that I did it when it gets sufficient rain. I timed it and watched those things grow. And then wake up one morning and it's all gone. Well, sir, that is probably even worse than the theft of the goods from the shop. When we talk about the loss of $100,000 in crops by a farmer, let's bring it even smaller numbers. When we talk about the loss of $10,000 in crops by a farmer, it is not just the $10,000 that you would have gained had you sold that, because no, you don't have that at all. So you're starting from zero, so you lost the $10,000 sale, and you're working your way backward because you've also lost the time you spent planting the crops. You also lost the input cost of everything that went into those crops. And that is the livelihood of the farmer. In the same way, sir, that I go to my ministry and I put in my work. In the same way that the persons that drive a bus go every day and they put in their work and they expect to see their paycheck at the end of the month or when the pay cycle is due. The farmers expect, sir, to reap what it is that they sow. Sir, Ecclesiastes 3, 1-8 sets out all the things that there's a time for. Interestingly, sir, and if you look at them, they tend to go in a little bit of a descending order. So they start with the most important ones first and then come down to, I don't want to say the lesser ones, but the less severe ones. They say there's a time for everything under the heavens. Some say under the sun, depending on what version of the Bible you're using. It starts, sir, with a time to be born and a time to die. That's number one. You know what the second one is? A time to sow and a time to reap. Because the provision of food comes second only to the right to life. That was the Bible. A time to sow and a time to reap. And that dealt, sir, with the provision of food. And I'm sure that the writer of Ecclesiastes contemplated that the time to sow and the time to reap and the sowing and the reaping were being done by the same person. It is unconscionable. It is unconscionable for someone to reap a harvest that another man has planted. Okay? We talk about this theoretically. I've been theoretical so far. I recently, sir, have made the acquaintance of a number of farmers. And I hang out with farmers. I sometimes get quite generous gifts. Like somebody gave me a bag of potatoes. I don't know, sir, what I would do with a whole 100 pounds of potatoes, but my constituents benefited from it. But I've started to hang with farmers, and I've gotten to learn. I've actually introduced the member for St. Philip's South to a number of farmers himself. And sir, the things that I know now that I did not know before. Like, when I asked them, your canes, how come you all don't plant right up to the road? They said, but we do sometimes. But our first 10 feet I'm missing there is the monkeys. The monkeys break off that first 10 feet there. And you start to lose, when they plant, there's acceptable and perceived waste. You contemplate some loss. You contemplate some loss to rats. You contemplate some loss because the rain didn't come in properly. You contemplate some loss because the harvest stays in the ground too long. You contemplate some loss, sir, because of the monkeys. Those are things, sir, that are contemplatable and planned losses because in many instances you actually can't control those. The monkeys ain't got no conscience. But people do. And I was at one of the farmers' house a day when we got a phone call. And he got a phone call that his entire sweet potato plot had gone overnight. The entire thing gone. Not a piece in left. But monkeys pull out some. All gone. Every last sweet potato gone overnight. In preparing for today, sir, I've spoken to some of the same farmers. I've spoken to people in agriculture. And they explain the most heartbreaking thing is you put in all the work. And it's not that the thief takes some, but stealing has become such a calculated enterprise that their business, in the same way that you sow and you hope to reap, their business is to reap from you and to sell to somebody else. In every business enterprise, sir, you contemplate input costs. Every single one of us who has been in business or goes into business, no matter what business that you're in, you contemplate the input costs. If you are a landlord, at some point in time you had to buy the property and you have to do maintenance and upkeep on it. I started to point at my friend from Christchurch West, but he just happens to be on my left hand and I let using this hand. Right? Sir, if you are an artist, you have to buy the paints and the canvas. You have to put your time in, paint the artwork, and then you put it to sell it. If you're a farmer, you have to buy the raw materials that go into the ground and all the other things to prepare the ground in order for you to sell it. I was about to say a predial arsonist, but I don't want to call it so pretty. A bold-faced crop thief. His input cost is simply the cost of the gasoline and getting his car to your field to reap all your crops and to get a profit. So it is this enterprise, sir, that has no expenses and is solely profit. We cannot let that continue. Now, we keep talking, sir, about the poor black man. And you know what? All of us in here are to champion those who don't have a voice. All of us in here, we take pride in fighting for those in our constituencies or those across Barbados who can't necessarily fight for themselves. We take pride where they can fight for themselves up to a certain level, then we actually fight for them past that level. That is what we're here to do. We're here to, at the end of our term, leave Barbados better than when we found it. That's what we're here to do. Sir, my friend spoke about the persons who sell cane by the roundabouts. And I have no difficulty with a man selling cane by a roundabout. If you came by the cane legally. So I agree with my friend. Ask a man to produce a receipt. Vending itself is not a bad thing. I don't say move them from by the roundabout. Sometimes it's dangerous, but you know what? Until we find some place better to put them, that's not even the crux of what I'm coming at. I don't say stop them from selling the cane. I say ask for proof. Ask for proof. If you know somebody has never owned a cane piece in their life, they ain't got no family that growing canes in the backyard, but they're selling cane day in and day out in the season, not a little bit of cane. The cane has been peeled, the cane has been sliced, the cane has been packaged. This is their business. It is laid out. Some have coolers, large coolers. And that is your business. Show me where you got the cane. If you came by it by legal means, I have no difficulty with you. If you cannot establish where you got that cane from, I have a difficulty. Let's go to coconut vendors. I buy coconut water. I love buying coconut water. Sir, I put myself omnia presumuntur, which is the legal maxim, sir, that you presume that which should have been done has actually indeed been done. It's a presumption of legality. I know that persons have come by my father's house when they had the small coconut trees and asked for permission to pick the coconuts. Get the coconuts, give me 3, carry on the rest, because I ain't get them in the tree. I have seen people driving around in open fields. You see, they have that coconut tree in the middle of Rabland, fine, no problem. The men go and climb it and they get the coconuts. I have also sat at somebody's house and watched somebody going over somebody else's fence to raid their coconut tree. My father has bemoaned the fact that somebody we know, a youngster who came up with me, who cannot seem to even address his mind as to doing things in the right way, raided and stole every single mango out of my father's mango tree, everyone, and I saw him selling the mangoes. But my father's a pacifist. My father does not want to get anybody locked up. My father does not want to, my father's a pacifist. And that slid. But it slid for my father, whose only intention for those mangoes was to eat them himself or get them away. But what if I'm growing mangoes myself to sell? Then you rob me of a source of income. And so I'm trying to stay on the right side of this debate, right? Because I hear it from both sides, and I have my own opinions. I also know exactly how some people will try to extract a piece of what you say and make it look like something it was not. So allow me to be as clear, as pellucidly clear as I can be. I am for entrepreneurial activity, 100% in favor of it. I am for small business. I am for that man who decides rather than go and thief, I'm going to go and sell. I'm going to find a way legally to acquire and sell and turn a profit. And I will actually segue, sir. There's something a lot of people don't know about my relationship with the Honourable Member for St. Philip South. When I started working, sir, as a lawyer, I met this gentleman. At the time, he ran the Bajan posse. And he came to me and said, you know what? I used to go away on trips with him and the crew to watch cricket. That was back in the days, sir, when I had money and time. I used to go away and watch, and the days when cricket was worth following to watch. And the Honourable Member came to me and they said, look, Kensington needs a party stand. Everybody got a party stand. Kensington ain't got one. And we worked out a proposal. We joined with 2 other persons. And we put on the very first party stand at Kensington. The very, very first party stand. We were sandwiched between the 3Ws stand and the scoreboard in a piece of land that nobody didn't want. And we had to convert it into what it was that we did. We had to put up the stuff and take it back down. If there were 2 matches, you had to take it back down in between because that was the rule, and then put it back up. But the Honourable Member for St. Philip South looked at me, a one-dimensional young person who was just looking, trying to earn a salary, earn a living, and go on with my business, and said, there is so much more you can do. Why limit yourself? Why not try to do other things? Look at ways to make money. Look at ways that you could get into business for yourself. That's what the Honourable Member for St. Philip South did for me, sir. And since then, as a lot of people know, I've been in a lot of different things other than law. Many, many activities. If you come to me, if you're a young person, you come to me now with an idea, I'm going to back you. And a number of the persons from Christchurch East know this. If you come with an idea that I believe can work, I'm going to back you because at one point in time, somebody else backed me. I'm going to take my share of the profits because it is business. But I will back you and get you started. I will give you advice and I will encourage you to do more. No, I have no difficulty with people who want to better themselves, but you cannot better yourself at my expense. You cannot take my hard-earned crops, rip them off, rip them out, and sell them, and you pocket all that cash. That is blood money. But it doesn't even stop there, sir. We talk about tagging. I mean, there are many ways to get around. I don't want to stand here and explain the ways to get around the legislation and get around all the tagging and get around the receipts, because anybody who's applying their mind to it, right, will figure out a way to do it. Some of them are pretty obvious, and this is not to say that the legislation is deficient, because they did the best that they could with the circumstances, but crops being what they are, and agriculture being what it is a lot harder to tag and map and keep track of certain products. That's the reality. But we had to make a start somewhere. But even down to the tagging of animals. The tagging of animals only works, sir, if you could track that animal. But people in Barbados now go to farmers, enter their premises, and butcher the animals on the spot. On the spot. So all the tag in the air or the tag that's injected into the animal, ain't nothing, it's still there at the farmer's house or the farmer's property. But they butcher the animals on the spot. We keep seeing farmers saying, somebody came and stole my prize bull. Somebody came and stole this ram. Somebody came and stole this. Or that these were butchered, and we shut off our ears because nobody ain't get killed. Nobody ain't get hurt. And we don't take it seriously. We give it the name predial larceny and push it out there as that not so serious form of theft. It is theft, and inexcusable at that. Some of the farmers that were speaking to, sir, I asked them, what are you all doing? One farmer indicated to me that he hired a watchman. He had to hire a watchman. He said the fella ignorant. So I'm not going to call the farmer's name because it's reflecting his definition of the man. Not ignorant as in not educated. ignorant as in he's a watchman. He will do whatever he has to do to watch your property and make sure it's not stolen. He pays that man $1,000 a week. $1,000 a week. Another farmer that I messaged while we were hearing this debate was going on, he indicated to me that he spends between $75,000 and $100,000 in security to ensure that nobody steals his crops, because overnight you could wipe out a field of potatoes or a field of sweet potatoes. Overnight. So that is what they have to do. So their input costs are driven up because of the nature of worthlessness and lawlessness that is going on by some people. And sir, and some of us are to blame. If we're talking straight to this, sir, we're talking straight today, because this is something that has to be brought to an end. If the Ministry of Agriculture is going all out to make Barbados the breadbasket and to be able to provide and be self-sufficient in food and crops in Barbados, if we're asking the farmers to put your fields back into crops, we can help you, then we have to be taking it all the way to ensure that ye who sows, reaps as well. This is serious. I am glad to see that the fines and the penalties have increased, because it has to be taken seriously. And understand, you can hear a hue and cry, you know how you can lock up a man for 5 years for thieving a piece of cane, or how you could fine a man $100,000. We know, sir, that the fines and the imprisonment, the terms of imprisonment set out in legislation, always the maximum sentences. It gives the presiding officer a cap on what they can go to, but it's also a reference to show how seriously the lawmakers have taken that particular activity. I want to urge the judicial officers now. We are now taking it seriously from this place. The law at the end of today, and once it passes the Senate, sir, will have been passed. This is what the lawmakers intended. Let us now put it into action to protect the farmers and then secure our ability to eat in Barbados. Sir, this goes in line with dumping, but I don't want to segue into dumping. That'll be for another time. But we need to take the prairie larceny seriously. The other thing I heard, sir, about the use of drones, I've seen in the press recently somebody commenting on the amount of cameras there are in Barbados, right? And the use of drones and it being invasive and whatnot. Once again, sir, I was at somebody's house and they put up a drone. They were demonstrating the use of drone technology to me. And they put up a drone, sir, over agricultural holding. And there were 3 hot spots in the middle of a field. Now, they were showing me that you could use thermal. Now, understand, this was not being done because we knew. It was simply a demonstration of drone technology to me. And in the first demonstration of drone technology to me, the first one, within 5 minutes, sir, we hot spotted 3 people in somebody's agricultural holding where they had no right to be. 3. I say use the technology. It exists for a reason. Our criminals have become sophisticated. Our larcenists have become sophisticated. They're moving not by foot with a bag. They're moving with trucks in the night to raid your entire field and teams of people to clean out a whole field in the night. We cannot be using 1950s policing or 1950s enforcement in what is 2022 criminal activity and 2022 criminal technology. There are big profits in crop theft. So we have to use whatever is available to catch the persons and use whatever is available that they feel the full weight of the law. So my argument is this. While I am not here, sir, debating the pros and cons of the cameras on the poles or whatnot, and there's a place for those, because we as well know, sir, that the Barbados Police Service has recently been having a sterling record in catching and solving offenses. And a lot of that has to do, sir, with their ability to see persons or trace what has happened after the event. So if a crime occurs outside the Honourable Member for St. Christchurch West House, the police are going to go to his neighbors who may have security cameras and ask them for the footage. If there's a business down the road, they're going to ask the business for their footage if it shows somebody passing the street. And we have to use technology. It makes no sense to tie one hand behind our back when it's hundreds of thousands of dollars involved in this. It makes no sense, sir, to tie the Ministry of Agriculture's hand behind their back when the crop theft is in millions of dollars. When one farmer could lose $100,000 in a month, or in the case of a field of potatoes, $15,000 in a night. We have to take this seriously, and we need to go further. A lot of us need to examine our conscience and stop saying Kadir. When something is stolen from me, that's very personal to me. It hits me close to home. Sir, if something is stolen from you, you feel it. When somebody breaks into somebody's house, we say, oh my goodness, that a man's house is his castle. How could that happen to the poor person? That's what we say. Sir, so when we know that 5 pounds of beef costs, for want of a pulling the figure, $50, and somebody comes to sell us 5 pounds of something that should cost $50 for $10, we know they're making their profit because they have no input costs. We as well, we the consumers, need to also take a stand. We cannot expect to keep facilitating criminal enterprise by being the ultimate consumer of that criminal enterprise and expect the legitimate farmers and the Ministry of Agriculture to be able to keep doing their work, because there is a cost to what they do. If something is being sold at a price that is too good to be true, then it is too good to be true. So, sir, I actually did not intend to be on my feet this long, but I feel the pain of the Ministry of Agriculture. I started by commending them. I want to end by commending them. They have done an excellent job under the stewardship of this Minister of Agriculture, and I believe he has to be commended for his diligence, his driving his team, his inspiration, and him getting not just the ministry, but getting the buy-in of the farmers, a lot of whom were prepared to abandon agriculture, and he's gotten some to put their land back into cultivation, gotten some to put their lands back into sugarcane, and to clear the lands. When we drive around Barbados, sir, we are seeing a different Barbados. We are not seeing all of the bush that was our lot, no pun intended, back in the desolate years, sir. We are now seeing a Barbados that lands are delineated. We can see crops growing. We can see that we're trying to do something with the land. We can see the efforts being made by the Ministry of Agriculture and the farmers. We can see the efforts being made by the small farmers. Sir, let us now do what is necessary to protect our farmers. And let's go all out to protect them. And it's not just the big farmers. It's the small person who is growing their herbs in a wash pan in the back of their yard and come out the next morning and all the herbs and things gone, sir. So, I didn't mean herbs, I meant herbs. Herbs, sorry. But we need to recognize the difference that agriculture is going to make to Barbados. We need to recognize the difference it's going to make to the lives of our young people, to what we eat, the way we eat, to our overall health, to the reduction of the NCDs. We need to recognize that this is not simply a bill on paper, but this is a change of a way of life, and this is saying that we as a government are doing what we have to do to protect and secure a future for our farmers, our smallholders, and the agricultural industry as a whole. So with that, sir, I fully support this bill, and I commend all of those involved, and I look forward to Barbadians doing what we have to do to make sure that we stamp out petty larceny and protect our agricultural industry. With those words, sir, I'm obliged.
Honourable St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this House do suspend its proceedings until 2:30 today.
Question is that this honourable chairman be suspended until 2:30 p.m. All those are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting, the ayes have it. This Honourable Chamber stands suspended until 2:30 p.m.